All right. Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, February 6th edition of the Cluster API Project Office Hours. If you have any topics that you want to bring up today, please go ahead and add them to the agenda. I will go ahead and put a copy of a link to that in the chat. All right. To start with, I have a PR up for the initial work for adding a pivot phase to Cluster Cuddle. It's still very much a work in progress. There are broken tests right now, and there's some additional testing I need to do. But I think I've solved most of the issues with the current pivot workflows. So I would definitely appreciate some eyes on there to get some initial feedback before I continue plugging away at it. For example, some of the things that I've addressed, it now migrates machine objects and cluster objects for all namespaces instead of just a single namespace. It also deletes objects from the source cluster after they've been successfully migrated over to the target cluster. And to do that, I kind of follow the links to make sure that we're only deleting it after all of the dependent objects are migrated over. And I've also fixed some ordering issues that I saw because the current pivot workflow it attempts to migrate machine deployments before it migrates machine sets, before it migrates machines. So if you do have machine deployments or machine sets in there, there's a potential that while those migrations are happening, that you're going to get duplicated objects created before the dependent objects are migrated over. So the pivot PR kind of fixes the ordering there to make sure the machines are migrated over before the machine sets, before the machine deployments.
Just a quick question. How would that work in terms of owner refs? Like if you migrate a machine with an owner ref to something that doesn't exist yet?
That's a good question. That I haven't fully verified. We could actually probably clear out the owner refs and have them recreated because of the label links. But the other thing too is right now I am scaling down the stateful sets in the source cluster. One thing we could potentially do is scale down both the stateful sets in the source cluster and the target cluster while we're doing the migration. And then only re-enable or only scale them back up in the target cluster after all of the objects have been migrated over. And then that would solve the ordering issues with the machine objects.
Okay, sorry, I'll try to speak up. Yeah, if I recall, there should be some adoption logic that you could rely on in the machine set if you decide to go that way.
Yep. But this is one of the reasons why I was seeking feedback to make sure that I'm not missing things like that for sure. All right. Next item on the agenda is Vince, who has a PR out there for creating a more concrete but still relatively soft link between machines and a cluster.
Yeah, so the PR addresses the issue number 41, which asks for a stronger link between machine star to a cluster. Some folks I think prefer the label approach, which is the one implemented in the PR. I know there was some discussion between labels versus annotations. I would love some more feedback. The goal of the PR is to solve specifically the problem that we're having right now of creating multiple clusters in the same namespace, which is not allowed at this point, and also allowing still some providers to not specify any labels and assume that the cluster will be nil when the machine actuator will run. That's it for me.
Vince, I have a quick question. So there was earlier a PR that was merged specifically to allow the machine controller to function like without the need of cluster object being there. I mean, that was like, I think merged like about 20 days ago or so. And I'm just looking at your code change. One of the things that you have altered here is turn, for example, in the machine controller, a check where you see where it was only logging that the cluster not found. Now you've modified that to basically return an error. I mean, that was one of the precisely the thing that was actually changed in that previous change. I mean, that was actually the intent of that. So to me, like this PR and what was merged like 20 days ago, they're kind of in two different opposite directions. I don't know, like maybe.
So yeah,
if you had some discussions around that, please.
So the logic actually moved in get cluster. The get cluster will look if there is a label, and if there isn't, it will actually return nil cluster and a nil error, which like retain the same purpose as before.
Yeah, I think the behavior stays the same as well.
Does that make sense?
All right. Any other questions on that topic before we move on? All right. Next up.
Sorry, I was just I just wanted to say, like, I think the label approach is fine. I'm not a big fan of how it's being implemented right now, though, because it is asking for a specific cluster label to exist. Cluster is equal to something. Like, if we were to rely on labels, I would expect us to rely on something like selectors.
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would like to kind of decide is like if we want to like use labels or annotations. Just you had some thoughts around that. I'm fine using the label selector, and that's like a much nicer approach too. But if we go down the annotation route, I would like to know if like what everyone thinks about.
I like the label approach personally. I don't like the annotation approach. But if anyone else has any objections or comments.
So there was one comment about the label is that like users could potentially change the label. I think this particular issue could be solved later on with like a validation webhook approach. And I mean, it's like we can just open an issue and like solve that problem later if that's fine with everybody here.
Well, and also the key for the label, if we go with a label approach, ideally would be namespaced. So cluster API.kates.io/something or other. And users should hopefully understand that if they see a label that they don't really recognize or understand what it's for, they should leave it alone. And if they modify it, whether it's accidental or on purpose, it's basically user error at that point.
So I haven't looked too closely at this yet, but is it my understanding that this is just going to be a single label that points to a cluster for it to own?
Yes.
I think what Mason was trying to point out then is usually when we have ownership via labels, like the cluster object would have a label selector field, giving label expressions that it would match against. If it's going to be a single label always, would a controller ref make more sense?
Oh, so you're saying invert the direction then, so that you'd put the label selector on the cluster, and if something matches, great. If not, it doesn't. But then
I'm not saying do either. I'm just saying I think what Mason said about selectors is usually have a controlling object with a selector of labels, the things it wants to control, and the objects have the labels. But if we're going with a single label that's always there, then maybe consider a controller reference in the metadata of the machines back to the.
Could you put this thoughts in the PR so that I can look at it offline?
Yeah, I'll comment on the PR.
Yeah,
Again, this is just a suggestion. You don't have to go with it this way if it still makes sense to do the label. I was just throwing my 2 cents in.
No, of course. I think it would be great so that like, we can discuss offline. Yeah, sounds good.
All right, moving on to the next topic. Pablo, state of controller implementation in the repository.
Yes, my question is because I've been asking asked that in a couple of open office meetings, and there was not like a consensus of the state of this. I mean, it's like the code is there, but at the same time, there was some person, I can't recall the name, that was like creating a new machine controller. I was starting like from scratch, implementing all the controller logic. So I went to the repository. I looked. There was a lot of stuff there. For me, makes sense what I'm seeing, but to be honest, I don't know what the state of that. I've been seeing some activity, not quite recently, but recently. So before jumping into that, my question is, I'm personally interested mostly in starting implementing a machine provider. So to be more specific, the kind machine provider, a machine provider for testing environments. I'll be discussing that with the kind project. But I don't know if I have to start implementing the controller or most of the logic of the controller is already in the repository. So if I can just take a look at and try to figure out myself, but I will really appreciate your opinion of the state of this implementation.
So I think a lot of this should be covered within the Git book documentation, as far as what you need to implement to get a provider going and what, the kind of step-by-step how to get started.
He wants to do it like more of a ingrained into cluster API proper itself. At least that was the conversation piece. But I don't know if timing is accurate. Like you could absolutely take a look at this now, but I don't know if we'd want to entertain that type of refactoring work yet until we get past the V1 Alpha 1 phase, as we mentioned in the kind call. I think that you could probably do the work, and there are people here who could help guide that in a proper LZ. But I don't think it will be landed until after the actual release of V1 Alpha 1.
Okay, but my question is like the code is already in repository. We make reference to the book, by the way. Is that actual? This code is intended to be cheap, a starting point for implementing the controllers, because what I understand is that the difference between the controller, they basically keep track of the state of the API-related objects, machine set, machines, and then there are the actuator, I think is the name you give it, which is the one to actually go and, for instance, provision one specific machine. My understanding is that the controller part should be theoretic because it's acting on the API objects, and the provider or actuator should act on the specific instantiation of that. But and I like the way this is split. And actually, part of my question is if this split is kind of part of the proposal, or is up to the provider just to implement everything. I mean, there is any because for me it makes no sense. I mean, if I want to implement a machine provider for whatever platform, very much machine provider, I will focus only on providing the machine, the creating and the startup of the bootstrap of the machine. I will expect that the rest of the logic, reconciliation logic, should be generic. That's my understanding, and that's what I understand. That's what I see in the book. But now my question is, should I or could I take this code from the repository and start working on that, assuming that that is going to be, I don't know, maintained, or is the intention of as part of the scope of this project to offer that kind of basic logic so that the providers only focus on the platform specific part? Because I remember that in another meeting, someone mentioned that refactoring effort, but I don't know what refactoring effort is. Refactoring what? I mean, which code?
I don't think you're obligated to use the actuator. I think everyone that is right, as far as I know, everyone is using it today. I don't know if there's anything implicit in the actuator that sort of defines any behavior that we haven't defined formally. I think there is a lot of behavior in the machine set controller, but that is generic anyway.
Okay.
I personally, my 2 cents, I'd use the actuator, but there's also not a ton of it. So if you're finding the actuator is a pain, then let us know why. But it's not a big deal to write your own controller, but I would use the actuator unless you have a reason not to.
Okay.
All right. Anything else on that before we move on? No. All right. Next one is a general PSA out there for the AWS provider. We want to kind of reset our version numbers and kind of throw away our previous releases. We wanted to give folks here, and this is a larger forum than our office hours meeting, so we wanted to kind of advertise it out there to make sure that that's not going to be a major problem for anybody who's been consuming the AWS provider code to date.
Well, do you want to give a little bit of background on why we're going backwards?
Well, the main reason why we're going backwards is because you know, we started off with the v1.0.0.alpha.x numbering, and we want to kind of go back to a more sane kind of pre 1.0 version because we are implementing many breaking changes over time. So until we get into a much more stable release, we'd like to be, you know, semantic version wise in a better place.
Yeah, that's reasonable and explains it better. Thank you.
For what it's worth, I opened an issue. I don't want to bike shed here now, but if folks have thoughts on it, with regards to how are we going to build and version across providers once we actually hit V1 Alpha 1, and how we want to manage and track and maintain that. That's a long conversation, which we can probably start to bike shed on the issue, and then maybe next week we can discuss that.
So are we following like a standard versioning approach across all providers in case users want to use or users use multiple providers?
That's exactly the topic I want to bring up in that issue.
Okay.
How are we going to manage this? How are we going to version it? How are we going to build it? How are we going to track it? There's a lot of details and logistics there.
All right. Moving on to the next topic. Hui, you have an item about integration test?
Yes. I basically just want to follow up this issue. I think it's been brought up briefly before. So I looked at the code, the repo. Since I cannot find any existing integration test in the main repo, and basically to implement this kind of a test, it's required non-trivial working to implement the actuator stuff, maybe. So my question is, since we are doing our integration testing in different providers, do we still want to add this for the main repo?
So in my opinion, I think there is value in having integration tests in the main repo to ensure that as new releases are cut and they're consumed by the downstream providers, that we have some type of assurance that there aren't any major breakage there.
I wonder if we could write a no-op machine actuator that doesn't actually do anything.
You see, this kind of fits into that kind space where like I'd like to have a test jig in the main cluster API repository eventually, where you could actually test the full life cycle of the actuators, right?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing as Justin also, which is having like a no cloud provider dependency actuator just for test harnesses would be really useful for this sort of integration test, just to sort of test logic that's a little bit larger than a unit test. And then that could eventually turn into kind if we wanted to.
It would also be useful for the Git book. Instead of asking people to create files, if we actually had an implementation in tree, they could just copy a directory and have an actuator.
Okay, I'll continue to look into this. So I assume this is still a V1 Alpha 1 issue we want to pursue.
I think it would still be a V1 Alpha 1 issue, unless there's anybody that objects there. All right. The next item is intro and an interface config, and I don't necessarily want to mispronounce your username there.
That's no problem. I'm John Belmerick. I'm at Google. I'm just getting involved here with the cluster API stuff. I recognize a few of you from Seattle from a late evening there, but anyway, I just wanted to introduce myself. I'll be showing up for a while now, and one of the things I was going to look at first, I noticed that the interface config, in particular the IPAM functionality, is currently embedded in the provider spec. And I'd like to make a proposal to bubble that up so that we can use something like a common mutating webhook to allocate IP addresses and things like that. And every provider doesn't have to integrate with different IPAM solutions.
I know Nadir had previously done a little bit of work in that area as well, so he might have a little bit of input as well.
Great, yeah. So I guess I'll start, I'll create an issue, and then maybe people can comment. I'll put my thoughts in, and then we can kind of start to have a discussion.
I think that sounds great, and welcome.
Thank you.
Moving on, Chuck relaying a message for Ilya.
Yeah, he asked me just to share the issue link that he created today. It's generally around a high-level discussion about cluster API focus. If anybody had thoughts regarding that in response to that or feedback there, he would appreciate that.
All right, so this probably ties a little bit into the proposal that Vince and Robbie started putting together as well. Yep. So while it doesn't make sense to focus on it for V1 Alpha 1, I think we definitely want to probably rally around finding some kind of consensus between Ilya's proposal and the proposal that Vince and Robbie are working on to try to get to a better place post V1 Alpha 1.
Yep, definitely post V1 Alpha 1.
So, if you get a chance, please do look at the issue, provide some feedback. But at some point after V1 Alpha 1, we'll probably have to have a proposal period and start hashing out kind of a direction from the multiple proposals. All right. Next item, Vince with the pull request.
Yeah, I stuck this on here on Vince's behalf.
Yeah, I was saying, did I write this?
I think this pull request is fine. I just wanted to point out that we're starting to modify some of the generated YAML files in a few places, and in this case, it cleans up our code. This is a good change, but it's going to make the repository a little bit more fragile because people are going to inadvertently start reverting some of these changes when they run make after they're generating the API types. So Vince suggested adding a pre-submit check, as we've done for another one of these changes that we made. But I think maybe this is some feedback we should maybe try to take back to the KubeBuilder folks, which is, how would they suggest that we handle these sorts of changes, right? Like we know that there's some tweaks and customizations we need to make to the CRD definitions to make them correct. And they keep getting clobbered, right? And I think in general, KubeBuilder tries to use a scaffolding approach. And in this case, they're overwriting instead of respecting our scaffolding.
So I think in this case, with the PR that you linked, that's actually adding the generated descriptions that didn't make it in a previous PR that added that field. But we did have an issue recently where a change was reverted after it was merged in because of that exact reason, though, because KubeBuilder kind of regenerated it and removed it.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood what Vince's comment in the PR. I thought that this one would do the same thing. If this is just regeneration, then that's even easier to approve.
So this is actually the provider ID PR that was merged, I think, last week. Didn't regenerate the CRDs, which now, like the 3 PR that I opened like this week actually had this change, all 3 of them. And people were getting confused, like why we're changing something that like it wasn't related to it. So I'll probably like remove this from this PR and open a new PR and fix it in the CI. So that like when CRD needs to be changed, it's caught in CI and like PR don't get merged. The other issue was that we reverted back some manual CRD changes, which I think we will probably need to open up an issue upstream with KubeBuilder. Yeah, because that specific use case is not supported. So yeah, that PR got reverted and like we never fixed it.
Yeah, and that one was specifically related to KubeBuilder not supporting a validation annotation that the CRD spec actually allows for OpenAPI validations.
Yeah, I guess like this brings up the question, like should we have like changed the CRD manually in any case, or should we bring the support to KubeBuilder so that like we can regenerate CRDs? It's a broader question, but
yeah, I think ideally we would be able to do things upstream so that we're not fighting with the tooling. But I think it's fine until the tooling is updated to put the workarounds in place that unblock us.
Okay, maybe then we should use customize to do that, I guess. Yeah, or a bunch of bash script. I don't know.
Yeah, I think maybe customize and some Bazel goodness to put those changes back after we do the controller gen, maybe.
Yeah, yeah. Agree.
Any other discussion on that topic? All right. Next item is from Stephen Augustus. How do we know that we've reached V1 Alpha 1? And I will defer either to Robert or Tim to go into that.
We're tracking against a milestone or milestones for CAP-B repository. And once CAP-B reaches the milestone, we'll probably cut it, and then downstream providers can then track and match and then try to update. So that release semantics of how we're planning to sort of coordinate that across different providers is an open-ended question to deal with for the actual release. So TLDR is that there's a milestone.
Okay, so like the milestone seems squishy to me, so I wasn't sure if it was like we had finitely defined all of the things that were going into it, or what.
We've done a good job of booting everything out that's not important. It is somewhat squishy in the fact that as we get closer and closer, we still find things, but it hasn't grown. It's actually been tracking downwards for the last couple of weeks.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
Yeah, as Tim mentioned, if this topic I think is a common one people ask. We discussed it I think 2 weeks ago at a meeting. There's like a section in the notes that literally says like, how do we know when we're done with the alpha milestone? And I think since then, I think 4 or so issues have been closed out of like 24, which is pretty decent in terms of velocity. And there are a number of things in the milestone that we left in there that we said we'd be willing to kick out if we got towards the end. So yeah, I agree. It's a little bit squishy because we overtrained on leaving things in to remind us that we might want to do them instead of it being particularly harsh. So we'll be harsh as we get towards the end date.
Sweet, thanks.
We have a soft date targeted for around the same time as 1.14 release.
Which is, when is 1.14?
It should be on the milestone, the actual date.
I think it's towards the end of March.
Yeah, end of March.
All right, and that brings us to the end of our agenda. Are there any other topics, questions, concerns that anybody has?
Are there any, so I'm, for context, I'm working on essentially refactoring the cluster API for Azure, or CAPC, I'm affectionately calling it now. I'm wondering if there are I'm pretty much modeling a lot of the stuff that I'm doing off of the AWS work. So I'm curious if there are any things that I need to be watching out for that are coming up.
So I think the one thing would be the PR that Vince has out there for changing how we're linking clusters and machines. That could potentially affect providers. But outside of that, I'm not currently aware of anything, and we're specifically booting kind of major breaking changes outside of V1 Alpha 1.
Yeah, I would say if you're looking at like the longer view, the docked events when I started, it would be great to get your feedback on that because that's going to be a larger sort of reshuffling of the API.
Sorry, where is that? Is that linked in the notes? Sorry if I'm missing it.
It's definitely linked from last week, and it is linked from the bottom of the issue that was referenced earlier that Ilya opened.
Cool.
As well.
All right. Any other topics? All right. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a good rest of your day.
Thanks, Jason.